Kensington Olympia is a strange station, isn't it? I mean, it takes up a lot of space, but it's only 3 platforms, and one of them isn't even in use most of the time. It's on the edge of Kensington, but it's the least served tube station in London. Oh, but it gets stranger. It used to be one of the most important stations in London. It could have been an international station. Had history gone very wrong, it could have been the departure point for the last train ever. So, let's wait for ages at Earl's Court, get annoyed, take a train to Wimbledon, change at West Brompton, and head to Kensington Olympia. These days, Olympia is served by the Mildmay line of the Overground, Southern Railway services, and the District line of the Underground. But it was originally built as a station on the West London Railway, and that is a line with a checkered history. This is actually the 3rd attempt to build a station in Kensington on that line. This line began as the Birmingham, Bristol and Thames Junction Railway, which was authorised in 1836. This was the Wild West of railway construction, when the general attitude seems to have been, build a railway now, ask whether it's actually useful later. The Birmingham, Bristol and Thames Junction Railway did not go to Birmingham, or Bristol, or the Thames. In fact, it went from Willesden to somewhere near Kensington and would later be renamed the West London Railway. Here is how little clue the promoters had. They didn't think they would need locomotives. They literally believed that the carriages could roll down the line on their own. At most, they figured maybe they would need a couple of horses to pull them up again. They were eventually persuaded to buy a train. A single train, mark you. 1 engine, 3 coaches, 8 wagons. The hard water in the area meant that the engine quickly got furred up with limescale. They had no luck with water because the line also suffered from flooding. It opened in May 1844, and this may come as a shock to you, did really badly. It closed to passengers in December 1844. In the meantime, it had gained the nickname of Punch's Railway due to that magazine frequently pillorying it. A typical piece read, "Omnibuses have been put on to meet the trains. The meetings have been strictly private, no one having been present but the driver of the omnibus and the guard." This might have been satire, but it is true that by November the line was carrying an average of 8 passengers a day. One of the early problems was the location of Kensington Station. Even back then, Kensington was seen as a desirable place to serve, but the original station was built in the basin of the Kensington Canal, quite a long way from what was considered to be Kensington proper. This was opened in 1840. In 1844 they built a new one just south of the current Olympia station. While the railway was a disaster in itself, it was not without its use in the bigger picture. 2 other railway companies took an interest in the route, the London and Birmingham Railway and the Great Western Railway. Both of them had used the railway before it went bust. The Great Western Railway ran to Bristol and the London and Birmingham ran to, well, Birmingham. Hence the original name, the Birmingham, Bristol and Thames Junction Railway. It was a connection between those 2 large companies. The London and Birmingham and the Great Western took over the line jointly with the West London Railway Company, although the latter was in so much debt that they were basically lodgers on their own railway. The bigger companies made plans to extend the line towards the Thames and over the river to Battersea, where it could connect with the London and South Western Railway and the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway. This could potentially make the line incredibly profitable. It would provide a connection for trains from just about anywhere in mainland Britain. As a result, the new line was opened as a partnership between the London and North Western Railway, which the London and Birmingham had become part of, the London, Brighton and South Coast, the London and South Western Railway, and the Great Western Railway, or the LNWR, LBSC, LSWR and GWR, because there are only so many times I can say the word railway before it loses all meaning. The extension was built using the bed of the disused and stinky Kensington Canal and opened on the 1st of April 1863. With that came a new station, which at the time was known as Addison Road, but you would know it as Kensington Olympia. You know, the station this video is about. Lots of railways wanted to get in on this. As well as the partners, the South Eastern Railway and the London, Chatham and Dover ran trains here. In 1864, the Metropolitan Railway built a branch from near Latimer Road to the West London line. Weirdly, they didn't run their own trains here, at least not at first. It was a joint venture with the GWR, built as part of the Hammersmith and City line. Speaking of the GWR, their presence created a bit of a problem. The London and Birmingham Railway had been engineered by Robert Stephenson, and the GWR had been engineered by Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Two giants of Victorian railway engineering with radically different ideas of how railways should be. Stephenson's railways were built to a gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches, what is now standard gauge in Britain. Brunel's were built much wider, 7 feet and 1/4 inch. And this meant that anywhere the GWR shared tracks, the rails had to be laid to a mixed gauge, capable of holding both kinds of train. It was a pain, and eventually a parliamentary commission would rule against the broad gauge, with the GWR converting the last of their track in 1892. Ironically, Stephenson and Brunel were actually good friends. Anyway, long story short, there had to be mixed gauge track at Addison Road. Addison Road was originally planned to be very different from the station that was actually built. It was intended to be south of the road bridge rather than north as it is now. It would have had passageways leading all the way to Brompton Road, which, to put that into perspective, would have meant that the southernmost entrance would have been beyond West Brompton Station, which is currently the next station down the Mildmay line. The station as built incorporated sidings for locomotives to change over, and also sidings for carriages to be unloaded. What I mean by that is, wealthy folk would sometimes put their carriages, the kind that run on roads, onto a flat wagon which would be hitched to a train. The station had a wooden building which was apparently quite substantial. Initially there was only one platform though, with a crossover to allow trains to change direction. In 1868, a line from Richmond via Hammersmith would join the West London. There was no exhibition centre, and what was there was the Royal Vineyard. It was basically the countryside here. Kensington was really a village compared to what it is now. But that would soon change. The railways would bring expansion. Soon, Addison Road would be surrounded by houses, their occupants drawn to the vast array of services from the local station. Soon that one platform would prove inadequate, and another platform would be added on the west side of the line, along with a locomotive turntable. There was also a refreshment room, which apparently smelled so bad that the station master claimed it made him ill, and he had to resign in 1872 from ill health. Also in 1872, an underground line arrived here. A proper one this time, none of this namby-pamby building a connection and then not using it nonsense. This was the District Railways line from Earl's Court. It didn't use the bay platform as it does now, that wasn't finished. And indeed wouldn't be until 1947. In 1885, the Royal Agricultural Hall Company built their exhibition centre here, the one you'd know as Olympia, London. And this, of course, increased traffic even further at the station. As well as passengers, there was a substantial amount of milk traffic here. In those days, milk was transported in metal churns, and residents on the west side of the station complained of the sound of clanging up to 3 in the morning. Parcels trains were also frequent visitors. There was even the occasional royal train. It must have been something of a train spotter's paradise, with the possibility of up to 8 different companies' locomotives showing up here. At various times, passengers might catch trains to Victoria, Crystal Palace, Henley, Reading, Broad Street, Brighton, Dover, Southall, Croydon, Waterloo, Windsor, Moorgate, Euston, Ludgate Hill, and many other destinations. Trains seen here could be made up of first-class carriages to the Channel ports, all the way down to cattle trucks for Smithfield Meat Market. But the 20th century would bring changing fortunes. The tram and underground networks were expanding rapidly. By the 1910s, the motor bus would also start making inroads, so to speak. Not that the staff at Addison Road were particularly worried. There were still plenty of passengers, particularly on exhibition days. Exhibitions required exhibits, and those arrived by rail. Early cars and aircraft put on show were a challenge for station staff. Personally, the show I'd like to have seen was the 1901 piece, simply described as a show of educated pigs. But the fact of the matter was that while exhibitions could bring in 30,000 passengers a day, the thing was that while you could get to many, many places from Addison Road and other stations along the West London line, the routes were often rather circuitous. Now that alternative modes of transport were appearing, faster or cheaper or both, people were less interested in the West London line. Still, the line remained a useful connection, and this would never be more apparent than at the outbreak of the First World War. Addison Road found itself used as an embarkation point for troop trains around the clock, as well as horses and artillery. Many of those men would not return, and many others would return injured. For the latter, ambulance trains were unloaded here. By 1917, up to 5 a day. Prisoners of war, too, were brought here and housed in the exhibition centre. Belgian refugees detrained here. Arguably, Kensington Olympia has never been more important than it was during that fierce conflict. The war ended in November of 1918, but the railways still had work to do. Everything that had been sent out had to be brought back in, and vice versa. But then, aside from exhibitions, things quietened down. In 1923, the railways of Britain were grouped together into 4 massive companies, which meant that the main line trains through Addison Road were now run by the Great Western Railway, the Southern Railway, and the London, Midland and Scottish Railway. Also the District and Metropolitan Railways, because underground lines weren't counted in the grouping. In 1927, the line to Richmond was abandoned. During the Second World War, Addison Road again found itself useful. It wasn't the important embarkation point it had been before, but the Army Catering Corps used it as a base during the Dunkirk evacuation. The station would be hit by bombs 4 times, with one destroying the buildings on the east side. Fortunately for Britain at the time, none of those bombs coincided with Winston Churchill's frequent train journeys from the station. His special train ran under the code M599. Another notable frequent passenger was General Dwight D. Eisenhower. In the early days of the war, it was by no means certain that the Allies would win, and the government grimly considered the possibility that the south of England might be invaded. Addison Road was, in that event, to be used as a base for evacuation. This wouldn't be the last time this use was considered, as we'll discuss later. The line as a whole remained an important link in the network, but the railway companies had a funny way of showing their gratitude. Following the war, they decided not to bother repairing the extensive damage along the line. It wasn't a priority, given how badly the country's railways as a whole had been walloped. In any case, it was announced under the post-war Labour government that the railways would be nationalised. So, as of 1948, it would be someone else's problem. One change that did come was that in 1946, Addison Road became Kensington Olympia. Whether you spell that with brackets or not seems to be optional. The fact that the West London line was nowhere near as important for local traffic as it had been, coupled with the fact that it had connections to many different places, meant that Olympia was a good candidate to be put to other uses. In 1958, the station was rebuilt, largely because it badly needed it. Then in 1965 it was rebuilt again to incorporate a motor rail terminal. Cars in those days, at least your typical family car, didn't have the kind of range they do now, and the horrors of traffic jams on holiday routes were starting to rear their ugly heads. Motor rail was a system where you could drive your car onto a long-distance train and get your head down in a sleeping car as you went to your destination. This was the old terminal. On the site of those carriage unloading sidings, in fact. The service began in 1965 and it was branded the biggest and best motor rail terminus in Europe. Well, they were clearly very confident, but the golden age of motor rail wouldn't last very long. It was an expensive service and complicated to operate. Passenger numbers fell in the late 70s and in 1982 the motor rail terminus was closed. It's now a car park. I don't know if that's ironic. The station would also sometimes be used for relief when one of the bigger stations was out of use. For instance, when Euston was being rebuilt in the mid-60s, sleeper trains were sent here instead. But apart from motor rail, exhibitions and special occasions, there really wasn't much traffic for Olympia. There was only one regular British Rail passenger train, a shuttle between here and Clapham Junction. This was mostly laid on for the convenience of post office workers and was nicknamed the Kenny Bell. The line was unelectrified and the train was seemingly run using whatever rolling stock they could spare. In the infamous Beeching report, this was one of many services recommended to be axed. They didn't, though. Until the 1970s, there was still a regular freight service in the form of a milk train, although by now it used tankers and was a lot less noisy. An interesting use was considered for Olympia in 1972. At that time, there was a lot of impetus behind the idea of a Channel tunnel. Various sites were considered for a London terminus. Olympia was one of them. It had a number of advantages. It wasn't very heavily used, so it potentially had capacity. It was in a good location. It had good rail connections with the rest of the country. And as a legacy of Brunel's broad gauge, the line was capable of taking larger European rolling stock. Against it were the fact that road connections weren't great and the locals certainly weren't going to tolerate a lot of building work or changes to the character of the area. While there was an underground connection, there wasn't much capacity to increase services over it. In the end, White City came out on top as the preferred terminus. Well, no, in the end, the Channel Tunnel didn't happen until the 90s, and Waterloo was the terminus. Eurostar trains could be seen at Kensington Olympia, but only passing through on their way to the depot. To achieve this, electrification came to the West London line for the first time. But there was a more sinister use planned for Olympia. During the Cold War, the development of nuclear weapons technology made the government ever more pessimistic about the survivability of war. To enable the government themselves to survive, a massive underground bunker, which, depending on the era, was codenamed Stockwell, Subterfuge, Turnstile, Chanticleer, Peripheral, Burlington, or Site 3, was constructed in an abandoned underground limestone quarry in Wiltshire. This could supposedly house up to 4,000 senior politicians and civil servants. In the event of the Third World War breaking out, those designated survivors would be bussed from Westminster to Olympia, where they would board special trains, ostensibly going to Taunton. In reality, they would go to Warminster and then buses would take them to Corsham and the bunker. Fortunately, this plan was never put into action, and in any case, the development of ever more powerful warheads would render the bunker useless. In the event that some madman did push the button, we'll all go together when we go. On a happier note, the mid-80s saw the beginning of a turnaround for the West London line. Olympia had been scaled back in 1983 with the old disused bay platforms having their track pulled up and the space filled in for car parking. But in 1986, long-distance services began calling here once again. Also in 1986, the Network South East brand appeared on London's commuter routes. This was a revitalisation of many hitherto neglected routes around London and the South East, with improved services and facilities. It took them a while to get around to the West London line, but in 1994 services were restored from Clapham Junction through Olympia to Willesden Junction. Admittedly using somewhat elderly diesel multiple units, but it was a start. Interestingly, in the 1990s, the Channel Tunnel plans reared their heads again. As I said, Waterloo was the terminus, but Olympia was maintained as a backup in case Waterloo had to be closed for any reason. There was also a plan to potentially reopen the car terminal here for international traffic. While this was being considered, the network was undergoing privatisation, which basically brought an end to all that. But this European passenger services sign appears to have migrated over from the parallel universe where it happened. Further improvements would come this century. In 2007, the West London line became part of the London Overground, an initiative that in some ways is a spiritual successor to Network South East. It took over a number of underused lines and upgraded them. The route would eventually become part of an orbital line around the London suburbs, an idea that was certainly under consideration as early as the 70s. As part of all this, Olympia was rebuilt once again. The initiative appears to have paid off as the station now sees around 2 million passengers a year. But change has continued. In 2011, the District Line shuttle was reduced to weekends, public holidays and special events at the exhibition centre. In 2012, the footbridge was divided in two. The installation of ticket barriers meant that the footbridge would cease to be a public right-of-way, and this compromise was reached after many local complaints. Now, Olympia is an unusually large station for what amounts to a fairly basic commuter service. Still, you can see signs of its history, whether that's the old abandoned platforms converted into the community garden or the motor rail shed. And that's not exactly surprising. There's been so much history here you could hardly bury it all. Well, I do hope you enjoyed this Olympian tale from the tube. Is it a tale from the tube? I feel like Olympia is more of an overground station. Anyway, if you did enjoy it, please do leave a like, and if you would like to see more, you may wish to subscribe. As always, I'd like to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the cars to my motor rail train. And I shall see you all again very soon. Cheerio.